You don't have diabetes. Your reports are not dangerous. Your doctor said, just control your diet. But inside your body, damage has already started. This is prediabetes, the stage where most people still feel normal, while their body slowly shifts toward disease. And the scariest part? 80% of people with prediabetes don't even know they have it. Not because the condition is invisible to science, not because the tests can't catch it, but because it feels, in every physical sense, like being completely healthy. You wake up, you go through your day, you eat your meals, you sleep at night, and nothing about any of that tells you something is quietly going wrong beneath the surface. That gap between what the body is experiencing and what the person inside it feels is what makes prediabetes so uniquely dangerous among all the metabolic conditions medicine has named. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what stage you're in and whether you can still reverse it. Let's start with what prediabetes actually is, because the clinical definition alone doesn't tell the whole story. Officially, it's diagnosed when your fasting blood glucose sits between 100 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, when your HbA1c, a 3-month average of your blood sugar, falls between 5.7 and 6.4%, or when an oral glucose tolerance test shows your body is clearing sugar more slowly than it should. Cross any one of those thresholds and you're in prediabetic territory. Your doctor makes a note, gives you some general advice, and typically schedules a follow-up in 6 months or a year. And that's often where the conversation ends. But those numbers are only the surface of what's actually happening. What they're describing, underneath the percentages and the milligrams, is a fundamental shift in how your body handles energy. For most of your life, the process worked seamlessly. You ate, your blood sugar rose, your pancreas released insulin, insulin unlocked your cells, glucose flowed in, and your blood sugar came back down. Clean, efficient, largely invisible. Prediabetes is what happens when that second step, insulin unlocking the cells, begins to fail. Your cells have started responding to insulin's signal more slowly, more weakly, or in some cases barely at all. This is insulin resistance, and by the time your fasting glucose crosses 100 or your HbA1c nudges past 5.7, insulin resistance isn't developing. It has already developed. It's already there, already active, already shaping how your body processes every meal you eat. Because your cells are resisting insulin, glucose doesn't clear from your bloodstream as quickly as it once did. It lingers a little longer after every meal, a little higher than it should. Your pancreas detects this. It's extremely sensitive to blood sugar levels and responds the only way it knows how. It produces more insulin. Then more. It overrides the resistance by sheer volume, flooding the system with enough insulin to eventually push glucose into the cells that are reluctant to accept it. And for a while, this compensation strategy works well enough that your blood sugar numbers stay in a range that looks, on paper, almost normal. This is exactly why people feel fine. The pancreas is working harder than it was ever designed to work, and it's doing it successfully enough to keep the visible numbers manageable. But the cost of that success is invisible, and it is significant. The pancreas is not built for this level of sustained output. Beta cells, the specialized cells within the pancreas that manufacture and release insulin, have a natural capacity, and running chronically beyond that capacity causes wear that accumulates slowly and doesn't announce itself. Every week, every month that insulin resistance goes unaddressed is another period of strain on a system that has no obvious way of telling you it's struggling. There is no pain in the pancreas. There is no sensation of overwork. There is only the quiet, progressive exhaustion of cells doing too much for too long, and eventually, if nothing changes, the beginning of a decline that becomes very difficult to reverse. This is where most people are when they receive a prediabetes reading and walk away thinking the situation is mild. But here's what no one explains. Prediabetes isn't just about sugar. It's about your pancreas getting tired. And once that tiredness sets in, the damage spreads inward to places most people never think to look. 4 separate biological shifts are happening inside your body simultaneously, not one after the other, not sequentially, but all at once, overlapping, reinforcing each other, quietly compounding while you go about your life feeling entirely normal. Understanding these 4 changes is what separates someone who genuinely grasps the urgency of prediabetes from someone who simply knows their HbA1c number. The first is what's happening to your pancreas itself. Beta cells, the cells within the pancreas responsible for producing insulin, were designed to respond to blood sugar fluctuations in a measured, rhythmic way. A meal arrives, blood sugar rises, beta cells release insulin, blood sugar falls, beta cells rest. That cycle of effort and recovery is what they were built for. But in prediabetes, the recovery phase shrinks and eventually disappears. Because insulin resistance means cells aren't responding properly, the pancreas never gets the signal that enough insulin has been released. It keeps producing. Beta cells that were meant to pulse now run continuously, operating at an output their biology was never designed to sustain. Over months and years of this relentless demand, the cells begin to dysfunction, their insulin production becomes less precise, less effective, and ultimately less plentiful. Once beta cell loss reaches a significant threshold, it cannot be recovered. The damage to your pancreas that begins during prediabetes is one of the most consequential and least reversible aspects of the entire disease progression, and it is happening right now, during the stage most people consider merely borderline. The second shift is in your liver, and it is equally silent. Under normal metabolic conditions, the liver plays a careful balancing role, storing glucose as glycogen when blood sugar is high, releasing it when blood sugar drops, and generally acting as a buffer that keeps energy available and stable. But when insulin resistance is present, this system begins to break down. Glucose that can't enter muscle and fat cells efficiently gets redirected. The liver, responding to the excess, begins converting that glucose into fat, specifically into triglycerides, and storing those triglycerides within its own tissue. This is not a dramatic process. There is no moment when it begins that you could point to. It is gradual, incremental, and completely without sensation. But the result, over time, is the early development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a condition that compromises the liver's ability to regulate blood sugar, worsens insulin resistance further, and raises the risk of serious liver disease down the line. Fatty liver and prediabetes are so frequently found together precisely because they share the same metabolic root, and each one accelerates the other. The third change is in your fat cells, and this one is perhaps the least intuitive. Fat tissue is not passive. It is not simply a storage depot sitting quietly in the body waiting to be burned. It is metabolically active. And when it becomes inflamed, as it does in the context of insulin resistance and excess visceral fat, it begins behaving like a malfunctioning organ. The fat cells packed around your abdomen, the deep visceral fat that surrounds your internal organs, start releasing inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines into your bloodstream. These molecules travel systemically, raising inflammation throughout the body and, critically, making insulin resistance worse. This creates one of the most frustrating features of prediabetes, a self-reinforcing loop in which the metabolic dysfunction causes inflammation, and the inflammation deepens the metabolic dysfunction. Breaking this cycle is one of the central challenges of reversing prediabetes, and it cannot be addressed by focusing on blood sugar numbers alone. The fourth shift is in your blood vessels, and it begins earlier than almost anyone expects. The endothelium, the extraordinarily thin single-cell layer that lines the interior of every artery and vein in your body, is exquisitely sensitive to the chemical environment of the blood flowing past it. Even at the modest glucose elevations characteristic of prediabetes, this lining begins to experience oxidative stress. Free radicals accumulate. Microinflammation sets in at the vessel wall. Early structural changes begin to alter how the endothelium functions, reducing its ability to regulate blood flow, prevent clotting, and resist the buildup of arterial plaque. The cardiovascular damage associated with diabetes does not begin at diagnosis. It begins here, at this stage, in these vessels, while everything still looks acceptable on a standard blood panel. At this stage, most people still don't feel sick. That's what makes the next part so important. Because prediabetes does communicate, just not in the ways people expect, and almost never in ways dramatic enough to demand attention. It doesn't announce itself with pain or with sudden visible change. It speaks in quiet, deniable signals that are easy to explain away, easy to attribute to something else entirely, and easy to carry for years without ever connecting them to a metabolic problem that is steadily worsening underneath. Take the fatigue that comes after eating. Not the pleasant heaviness of a satisfying meal, but a genuine, pulling sluggishness. The kind that makes concentration feel effortful, that makes the hour after lunch feel like a battle against your own eyelids. Most people attribute this to eating too much, or to the natural rhythm of the afternoon, or simply to being tired from a busy life. But that post-meal fog is often something more specific. It reflects a blood sugar spike, glucose flooding the bloodstream faster than insulin-resistant cells can absorb it, followed by an overcorrection as the pancreas releases a surge of insulin to compensate. The resulting drop leaves the brain temporarily underfueled, and the brain interprets that as exhaustion. This is not a normal response to eating. It is a metabolic signal, and it is worth paying attention to. Then there are the cravings. Not general hunger, but the specific, almost urgent desire for something sweet or starchy that arrives an hour or two after a full meal. When cells are insulin resistant, they cannot efficiently absorb the glucose that is already circulating in the bloodstream. Despite adequate food intake, the cells are functionally undernourished. The brain, sensing this cellular energy deficit, responds with cravings designed to bring in more glucose. The craving isn't irrational. It is the body's logical response to a system that is failing to use what it already has. But acting on those cravings only adds more glucose to a bloodstream that is already struggling to clear what's there, making the underlying resistance gradually worse with every cycle. Belly fat that accumulates stubbornly and refuses to respond to dietary changes is another signal that tends to get dismissed as a cosmetic issue or a consequence of aging. But visceral fat, the deep fat stored around the internal organs, is not passive tissue. It is actively inflamed in the context of insulin resistance, releasing inflammatory molecules that worsen metabolic function and make fat loss progressively more difficult. The body, under insulin resistance, is biologically primed to store fat more readily and release it more reluctantly. Trying to address this with caloric restriction alone, without addressing the underlying insulin resistance, is like trying to bail out a boat without closing the hole. Mild brain fog that makes thinking feel slower or less sharp than it used to be. Triglyceride levels that keep nudging upward on annual blood panels. Energy throughout the day that feels less reliable and less consistent than it once did. Each of these, taken alone, seems easily explainable. Stress, poor sleep, age, work demands. The explanations are always available, always plausible, always enough to delay the deeper question of what is actually producing these experiences consistently across weeks and months and years. But taken together, these signals form a pattern, not a dramatic one, not one that sends you urgently anywhere, but a coherent and recognizable pattern of a body that is metabolically under strain, quietly, persistently, and in ways that will not resolve on their own without deliberate intervention. Do you feel sleepy after eating? That's not normal. Now here's the good news. This is the last fully reversible stage. That single fact changes everything about how you should think about this moment. Prediabetes is not a sentence. It is not a slow, inevitable walk toward diabetes that you are powerless to interrupt. It is a warning with a window, and unlike type 2 diabetes, which once established requires lifelong management and medication, prediabetes can be fully reversed. Blood sugar can return to completely normal ranges. Insulin sensitivity can be restored. The progression can be stopped entirely. The evidence supporting this is not preliminary or uncertain. It is robust, consistent, and drawn from decades of large-scale research conducted across diverse populations around the world. The mechanism behind every effective intervention is the same single idea: reduce the demand placed on your pancreas. That's it. Everything else is just a different way of achieving that same outcome. When your cells become more sensitive to insulin, when they start responding to its signal more readily, less insulin is needed to do the same job. The beta cells that have been running beyond their capacity finally get to slow down and recover. The liver, no longer receiving a flood of excess glucose it can't distribute, stops converting that surplus into stored fat. The inflammatory signals being released by visceral adipose tissue begin to quiet as the metabolic environment around those cells improves. The cascade of damage that prediabetes sets in motion is not irreversible. At this stage, it can genuinely be unwound. Losing 5 to 10% of body weight is one of the most evidence-backed interventions available. Not a dramatic physical transformation, not an extreme target, just a meaningful and achievable reduction that has been shown repeatedly to significantly improve insulin sensitivity and reduce the risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes. Resistance training 3 times a week works through a different but equally powerful mechanism. Skeletal muscle is the body's largest site of glucose disposal. And building and activating that muscle creates a biological demand for glucose that pulls it out of the bloodstream independently of insulin, reducing the burden on a pancreas that desperately needs relief. Reducing ultra-processed carbohydrates lowers the glycemic load delivered to your system with every meal, giving your blood sugar fewer extreme peaks to manage and your pancreas fewer emergencies to respond to. Sleep, which rarely appears on lists of metabolic interventions but absolutely belongs there, matters enormously. Even a few nights of insufficient sleep measurably worsens insulin sensitivity in otherwise healthy people. For someone already insulin-resistant, chronic poor sleep is quietly accelerating the very problem they are trying to reverse. And chronic stress, through the sustained elevation of cortisol it produces, keeps blood sugar higher than it should be around the clock, adding a continuous metabolic burden that no amount of dietary discipline can fully overcome on its own. None of these interventions is extreme. None requires perfection or dramatic sacrifice. Together, they work on the same root cause from multiple directions at once, and at this stage, that is enough. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you treat this the way most people do, as a borderline result, a mild concern, something to revisit later when life slows down or when the numbers get worse? Prediabetes doesn't stay prediabetes. Without deliberate intervention, the trajectory is not uncertain or unpredictable. It is well documented and consistent. Insulin resistance continues to deepen as the cells grow progressively less responsive. The beta cells of the pancreas, which have been overworking to compensate, continue to decline in both function and number. The liver accumulates more fat. The inflammatory burden in adipose tissue increases. And somewhere within 5 to 10 years, sometimes sooner, depending on individual biology and lifestyle, the blood sugar crosses the threshold that medicine calls type 2 diabetes. That crossing is not a dramatic event. There is no moment where you suddenly feel different, no obvious line you step over. It is simply the point at which the compensation the body has been running for years finally fails to hold the numbers in the prediabetic range any longer. And by the time that happens, The window that exists right now has closed. The reversibility that defines this stage, the genuine biological possibility of returning to normal metabolic function without lifelong medication, is no longer available in the same way. Type 2 diabetes can be managed, and in some cases pushed into remission with significant effort, but it cannot be reversed with the same relative ease and completeness that prediabetes can. The intervention required becomes harder, the stakes become higher, and the damage already accumulated in organs and vessels becomes a permanent part of the picture. Because the complications do not wait for the diagnosis. This is the part that most people find genuinely surprising, and that most clinical conversations fail to convey clearly. Nerve damage, the slow, progressive injury to peripheral nerves that eventually produces numbness, tingling, and pain in the hands and feet, can begin accumulating during the prediabetic phase itself. The kidneys, which filter blood continuously and are exquisitely sensitive to the chemical environment that blood carries, begin experiencing low-level stress at prediabetic glucose levels. The small blood vessels supplying the retina of the eye can begin showing early structural changes before a single diabetic threshold has been crossed. Neuropathy, nephropathy, retinopathy, these are not complications that arrive after years of diagnosed diabetes. They are processes that begin earlier, quietly, in the metabolic conditions that prediabetes creates. The cardiovascular risk follows the same pattern. The endothelial damage, the arterial inflammation, the rising triglycerides, the shifting cholesterol profile, all of it is already in motion, already contributing to a cardiovascular risk that is meaningfully higher than it was before insulin resistance took hold. This is not meant to frighten. It is meant to make clear what kind of moment this actually is, because prediabetes is one of the rarest opportunities chronic disease ever offers. A stage that is visible, that is catchable, where the damage is still minimal enough to reverse, and where the tools required to do so are genuinely within reach. Prediabetes is not diabetes. But it is a warning. The question is, will you treat it like one? If you watch the insulin resistance episode, this is the next stage in that same story. In the next episode, we'll talk about fatty liver, the silent organ damage that often begins right here.